When the first trailer for the new Dungeons and Dragons movie dropped a few months ago, I have to be honest and say that I did not think it was going to be very good. I had no intention of going to see this movie in the theater. I thought maybe when it came out on streaming, I would watch it. But then a funny thing happened. Last week, some of the early reviews started coming out for Dungeons and Dragons, and people were saying it was actually pretty good. And I was curious to see whether they had similar expectations to me, and the movie was just good in comparison to what they thought was going to be not a good movie, or were they actually saying this movie is just a good movie in general? Regardless, that was enough to pique my interest to pay money to go see this movie in the theater, and I'm surprisingly happy to report that I had a really good time watching Dungeons and Dragons. Just for some context, I don't play Dungeons and Dragons. I have never played before. My wife has played super casually a couple times since we've known each other. And I've kind of like overheard some of the sessions. I mean, I get the gist of it. Like I know what Dungeons and Dragons is. So, but all it is to say, I went into this with no experience in the game, with the game. After the movie ended, I talked with my wife and one of our friends who we saw the movie with who have a little bit more experience. And I was like, were there things that they referenced in the movie that maybe someone who had done it, hasn't played the game wouldn't have gotten, but like you guys were like, oh, that's cool, it's from the game. And they're like, yeah, there were a couple of items in a couple of locations that are like pretty common to use in the game. So all that is to say, this is a very approachable movie. It's a very accessible movie. It's not full of like those little member berry things, to borrow a word from another movie review YouTuber. It's not like you're going to miss out on like all these little tiny references. If you play the game, then you're probably going to get those, but it's not going to like alienate people who are watching this movie that have never played the game before. In general, I think what worked for me for this movie were a couple of things. First, I think the choice to kind of lean into a more comedic tone was a good one. I don't think that this movie should have taken itself too seriously. There was a Dungeons and Dragons movie that came out maybe like 20 years ago or so at this point, and that they tried to make like kind of in the vibe of the Lord of the Rings, which was really popular at the time, and that didn't work. So I think the people making this movie knew that they just wanted to try a different route, and I think leaning into the comedy was a great route to go. It allowed the viewers to not take the movie as seriously. And it just made it for a more enjoyable time. It elevated the mood. It made it like a fun movie. Most of the comedy worked. I'm at the point now where I'm realizing that Chris Pine is just like a naturally funny actor. He doesn't have to work hard for his line delivery to be funny. He just does it naturally. So I think his kind of comedic, kind of vibe worked for this movie. Also, just keeping in line with Chris Pine, I think he also knows how to hit the like emotional notes. There were some emotional moments in this movie that for the rest of the movie being kind of a comedy, you're wondering how those emotional beats are going to land, and for the most part they did. I didn't feel like anything was like overly cheesy or over the top. I felt for the most part the emotional elements work. And yeah, like I was saying, Chris Pine at this point I'm realizing like any movie that I've ever seen of him, any issues I have with that movie are not because of him. So Chris Pine, just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job. He was great in this movie as well. Another thing that really worked for me in this movie were actually the action sequences and the fight sequences. There's a character in this movie played by Michelle Rodriguez who I forget like what her like class is, what it would be in the game, but she's like a barbarian more or less, and so her style of fighting is very like hand to hand, and just kind of using whatever weapons she can get her hands on. And this movie would have every right to have those fight scenes be really choppy and like have one punch be like 3 different cuts before it lands. But all the action sequences were like pretty widely shot. You could see what was going on, and there were not a lot of cuts. It was not annoying on the eyes. There wasn't a bunch of cuts every half second. It was all very smooth, and so I thought that those fight sequences, again, this movie had no right to do those as well as it did, but every time that there was a fight sequence, I was like, this is done a lot better than even like some of the big superhero movies nowadays. So I really wanted to give the movie props for that. Something that this movie did not do, which a lot of movies based on a previously established intellectual property would have done, is it does not clearly set up for, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, it's a light spoiler, this movie does not directly set up for a potential sequel. This movie is a self-contained story. It has a start and an end, and everything from that story is wrapped up. Obviously, there's like room in this world to have further movies, but a lot of times, even movies that studios might think are going to flop anyways, they still leave like plot threads dangling to set up for a sequel that never happens. I'm hoping this movie does get a sequel. I mean, it's getting really good word of mouth. I'm pretty sure it's making a profit. So, but I appreciated that this movie did not like have a post-credit scene that sets up for a sequel, or have like, again, little dangling threads that are clearly setting up for a sequel. Again, obviously they can, like, if they want to, and I hope that they do, but I appreciate that this movie just was like, we're going to start and end the story. If it's successful and people like it, then we can make a sequel, just kind of with a fresh start and not have to pick up where the first movie left off directly. If I had to pick out something that I didn't like about this movie, there was a part kind of near the end, like as the third act was kind of starting, that I felt was maybe a little bit long. I mean, it was only like a 2 hour or so movie, but there was only like one part kind of near the end as the third act is starting to get into gear. I'm like, okay, this movie, like, it is feeling a little bit long, but again, after that, it picked up and I was like, I'm having a good time again. And you know, it's not as big a budget movie as some of the movies that are coming out now. So some of the special effects were like a little bit wonky, but I thought for the most part, like if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that bad CGI really takes me out of a movie, and I did not feel that at all in this movie. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this movie could have been called something completely other than Dungeons and Dragons, and I think it still would have been an enjoyable, like, kind of medieval-based fantasy film, and people still would have liked it. But having it be a Dungeons and Dragons movie, I think, does a lot to help the brand and move that brand forward into the cinematic world where it has previously not been able to do so. Yeah, I really enjoyed Dungeons and Dragons. I had no expectations for this movie. It was really the positive word of mouth that spread last week for the movie, and I was like, let's go see it. And I had a really good time. Okay, so Dungeons and Dragons, have you seen it? If so, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to stay tuned for more.